Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're plunging into a really high-stakes world. Think international diplomacy, covert operations, and, nuclear ambitions.
It's a heavy mix.
It really is. Our mission, yours and mine, is to unpack the critical events, the strategic decisions, and maybe some surprising facts that shaped this incredibly complex relationship between the U.S., Israel, and Iran.
Specifically focusing on Iran's nuclear program and that 2015 deal, the JCPOA.
Exactly. You've shared some fascinating sources with us, and we're going to pull out the most important nuggets, the key insights, to help you, our listener, understand the multi-layered challenges and perspectives here. Let's unpack this.
Sounds good. Where do we start?
Let's begin back in September 2020. This is just before the U.S. presidential election. Joe Biden makes this declaration.
Right. He pledged to offer Tehran a, quote, credible path back to diplomacy.
Yeah, and he said if Iran returned to strict compliance with the nuclear deal, the U.S. would rejoin it, but only as a starting point for more talks.
And he also wanted to work with allies to strengthen and extend the deal, plus tackle, other issues of concern.
And importantly, he called the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign an abject failure. A pretty strong statement.
It was. And what's really fascinating here right from the get-go is how differently the Americans and Israelis saw that 2015 deal, the JCPOA.
How so?
Well, from Israel's perspective, the deal did keep Iran about 12 months away from a bomb, roughly, until 2019. So some success there.
Right.
But it had huge flaws in their eyes, really significant ones. It was almost entirely focused on enriching uranium and maybe a plutonium path. It lipped out other critical things.
Like the missiles.
Exactly. The deal said nothing about Iran testing dual-use missiles. And for Israel, that was arguably a bigger short- and medium-term threat than the nuclear program itself.
Because those missiles could hit Israel directly.
Precisely. Think about precision-guided missiles coming from proxies like Hezbollah. They could cause devastating damage to Israel's home front. So Israeli analysts kind of figured Tehran's goal was maybe to reach the threshold.
Meaning, get everything ready to build a bomb quickly.
Yeah, exactly. Get right up to the edge, but maybe not cross it, specifically to avoid provoking an Israeli preemptive strike, a very calculated game.
Okay, so missiles were a big worry. What else beyond that worried the Israelis about the JCPOA?
Well, for one, the 2015 deal did absolutely zero to stop Iranian support for regional terrorism. That's a daily threat for Israel, not abstract at all.
Mm-hmm.
Then there was the whole sunset clause issue, the idea that most restrictions on Iran's nuclear program would just expire by 2030.
So not a permanent fix in their view.
Not at all. It was like a ticking clock. For Israel, this meant Iran could theoretically be banned from getting nukes, but without any real JCPOA sanctions teeth to enforce it after 2030.
And was there anything else?
Yeah, one more big one. The deal made no mention of a military option, the threat of force, which is a tool Biden might eventually need to actually get Iran to agree to any new, stronger agreements.
Okay, so given all these pretty deep reservations, how did Israeli officials react to Biden's initial statements about rejoining the deal?
Well, they watched him like hawks. Everyone from Netanyahu down. There was this interview Biden did with Thomas Friedman in December 2020.
I remember that one.
Right. Biden basically said he'd deal with the nuclear weapons issue first. Now, to Israel, that sounded like, other vital stuff like missile development might get pushed aside.
That sanctions might be lifted just for nuclear concessions alone.
That was the fear. Now, Biden did try to reassure them. He said sanctions could snap back if Iran didn't cooperate.
A full snapback? Could that work?
Theoretically, yes. If Biden could somehow rally the UN Security Council, a full snapback could hurt Iran even more than Trump's unilateral actions. But the Israelis were thinking, how's he going to pull that off without the maximum pressure campaign that Trump used, especially since Biden was openly against that approach?
Right. That's a fair question. But then things shifted a bit, didn't they? In January 2021, some of those Israeli worries seemed to ease up slightly.
They did. That's a really key moment. You had the incoming director of national intelligence, Avril Haines, and the new Secretary of State, Antony Blinken.
Okay.
Both of them stated publicly that the administration was, quote, a long way from rejoining the deal. And they were very strong, vehement about opposing Iran ever getting a nuclear bomb.
That must have been reassuring.
Oh, absolutely. It was described as music to the ears in Israel and also for places like the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Blinken even specifically said the U.S. would prevent Iran from reaching the uranium enrichment threshold. That gave a clear policy benchmark.
Okay, so some positive signs there for Israel. but you mentioned it was short-lived.
Yeah, unfortunately, because Blinken also made it clear that the U.S. would return to the 2015 agreement without demanding upfront concessions on things like ballistic missiles or Iran's regional behavior.
As long as Iran didn't make excessive demands.
Right, so for the Israelis, this looked like giving up crucial U.S. leverage way too early. Plus, the Biden team didn't seem to be in any huge rush to actually start negotiating.
Why was that, Dweeb?
Well, a couple of factors might have been at play. One could have been the Israeli election coming up in March 2021. Some reports suggest Biden maybe hoped Netanyahu would finally lose and didn't want to hand him a political gift.
Like a new Iran deal that Netanyahu could use to rally voters. Voters maybe fearing a, what was the phrase used? Shiite nuclear Armageddon.
Something like that, yeah. Plus, any new deal would take months to actually implement fully for the economic benefits to even start trickling down to ordinary Iranians. By that time, Iran itself would have a new government after its own elections in June 2021, so the timing was complicated.
Right, makes sense. So this brings us to the international inspectors, the IAEA. How are they handling things?
Yes, the IAEA and its chief, Rafael Grossi,
Yeah.
his role becomes really central here. So remember, Iran had shut them out quite a bit in 2020.
Yeah.
But Grossi managed to get access again to some disputed nuclear sites in August 2020. And he got explanations from Iran about their, let's say, deviations from the deal after the IAEA board condemned them back in June 2020.
So progress of sorts.
Sort of. By 2021, Grossi seemed to adopt this delicate new policy, basically try to avoid a major crisis that could lead to military action,
Okay.
while also calling out Tehran for giving, quote, inadequate answers.
Yeah.
He even came up with this very diplomatic phrase, not technically credible,
Which was basically a polite way of saying
saying they were lying, without actually saying liars, a classic diplomatic move.
he was walking a very tightrope then. What happened in February 2021? That sounds like a key moment.
It was. February 2021, Grossi holds this press conference, described as exuberant, and he announces that Iran would only reduce its cooperation down to about 70% of the normal IAEA inspection regime.
Only 70%. That still sounds like a big reduction.
It was a very significant reduction.
Yeah.
And interestingly, this announcement happened in the middle of the night, Israel time. Maybe, possibly to try and bury it a bit, deflect attention.
And what about evidence of cheating? Israel's Mossad was apparently providing information.
Right. By March 2021, when Grossi was asked about that evidence, he kind of dismissed it as an urban myth, and he just said he was an optimist.
An optimist.
Yeah, which strongly suggested he was prioritizing keeping the JCPOA framework alive, keeping the diplomatic path open, much like his predecessor had done.
That must have been incredibly disconcerting for Israel, especially with that temporary inspection deal about to expire.
Absolutely. It created a huge amount of uncertainty. And adding to that was Iran's own upcoming presidential election in June 2021.
Because they didn't know who'd be in charge.
Exactly. And you started getting these contradictory statements coming out of Tehran. It really looked like a power struggle between the pragmatist camp under President Rouhani and the hardline camp.
Led by Ibrahim Raisi, who was seen as Khamenei's favorite.
That's the one. Raisi eventually won, of course. Now, some analysts wondered if this was all just, political theater for the upcoming election.
But you think it was real?
The lack of coordination in the statements, it really suggested real substantive differences were playing out. The IAEA itself seemed to be kind of zigzagging, almost waiting to see who would come out on top in Tehran.
In hindsight.
In hindsight, it's clear the hardliners were consolidating control. Grossi getting that 1-month extension on the inspection deal. That was probably the last gasp of the outgoing pragmatists.
Because by mid-June...
By June 16th, Grossi himself admitted that reviving the nuclear deal would probably have to wait for the new Iranian government. And then Raisi won big on June 21st.
Over 70% of the vote, but low turnout.
Right, historically low turnout, around 49%. But Raisi's victory, given the hardliners' known opposition to the nuclear deal, certainly didn't signal smooth sailing ahead for cooperation or negotiations.
Okay, so while all this diplomatic maneuvering and political change is happening, there's another layer, the shadow war. Let's pivot to that. We know about the sabotage at the above-ground Natanz facility in July 2020, but apparently it was still running.
Yeah, parts of it were still up and running. But then, March 2021, a new, pretty alarming revelation comes out.
What was that?
A leaked IAEA report. It indicated Iran had started enriching uranium at a new underground plant at Natanz.
Underground. That's significant.
Hugely significant. And they were using advanced IR-4 centrifuges with plans for even more. Now, these IR-4s could drastically shorten Iran's timeline to a potential nuclear weapon.
So from Israel's perspective,
It looked like Iran had made this almost impossible comeback. Despite the July 2020 attack, despite the assassination of their top nuclear scientist, Fakhrizadeh, in November 2020.
who is replaced by someone named Farahi.
Right, in January 2021. Apparently a high-status commander from Iran's space program, though Israeli intel reportedly thought he was less competent than Fakhrizadeh. But the point is, this new underground facility, buried under maybe 40 feet of concrete and iron, much, much harder to strike.
But did Israeli intelligence think those earlier attacks, like the July 2021, were pointless then?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
The Jerusalem Post reported that the number of advanced centrifuges Iran actually had installed still paled in comparison to what they likely would have had without that earlier destruction.
But it did slow them down.
It did. And while going underground gives you security, it also creates logistical headaches. It just slows down the whole nuclear development process. A nuclear expert, David Albright, also noted Iran still seemed to lack the capacity to really mass-produce these advanced centrifuges.
So for someone like Yossi Cohen, the Mossad chief at the time,
For people like Cohen, this just proved their point. The effort to stop Iran getting a bomb was, quote, never-ending. And their view was that no site, old or new, underground or not, was truly unreachable. In fact, a new plan for the Mossad shadow war was reportedly already advanced.
and that plan became very public, very dramatically, on April 11th, 2021. Tell us what happened.
Right. Initially, the spokesman for Iran's Atomic Energy Organization, Behrouz Kamalvandi, he called it an accident. Just an issue with the electricity distribution, downplayed any injuries, any radioactive leaks.
But that wasn't the real story.
Not even close. And Kamalvandi apparently found this out the hard way, at his own expense, as one report put it. He supposedly fell down a 7-meter hole that's over 20 feet. When he visited the site afterwards, broke his ankle.
Wow, a fall like that suggests.
Yeah, a former UN nuclear weapons inspector pointed out a fall like that suggests really severe damage to the structure. And later reports, citing intelligence officials, confirmed it wasn't an accident at all, it was an explosion.
An explosion that did what?
That destroyed Natanz's internal power system. The estimate was it could take 9 months, maybe more, to fully restore it.
That's a huge setback. So a massive shift from the initial accident story. How did Iran officially react once this became undeniable?
Well, pretty quickly, another top Iranian nuclear official, Ali Akbar Salehi, confirmed it was an attack, and then the foreign minister, Zarif, directly blamed Israel, vowed revenge, naturally.
But he also said it wouldn't affect the nuclear talks.
Right, he tried to maintain that front, but later officials admitted the attack hit an electrical substation about 165 feet underground, and it damaged thousands of centrifuges. Thousands. And then you get this really remarkable comment from Faridun Abbasi Davani. He's a former head of Iran's Atomic Energy Organization, survived an assassination attempt back in 2010.
Okay, what did he say?
He said, quote, "The design of the enemy was very beautiful."
Beautiful. It's unexpected.
Isn't it? He suggested the attack might have been cyber or maybe sabotaged equipment smuggled in, or even agents in place. He really emphasized the importance of having boots on the ground for this kind of operation.
And for the Israelis, like Cohen or Netanyahu.
Hearing that kind of grudging admiration, that tipping of the hat from an adversary, that was likely a source of considerable pride. And strategically, it shook Iran's position right when those Vienna negotiations were supposed to be starting.
So how was an attack this deep underground carried out? What do the reports suggest?
The method most cited involves smuggling an explosive device into the facility itself and then detonating it remotely.
Like hidden inside something.
Exactly. This supply chain method, as it's called, had reportedly been used before, including in that July 2020 Natanz Sabotage. The story there was explosives hidden inside a heavy desk or piece of furniture.
And Israel has ways to do this.
Reports suggest Israel has gone to great lengths, worldwide even, to tamper with equipment before it even gets to Iran. Maybe concealing tiny listening devices or small explosive charges designed to be triggered much later.
Wow. Years in advance, potentially.
Potentially. Former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert hinted at something like that. He suggested missions might be prepared many years before, with machines essentially booby-trapped and waiting for the right time.
What kind of explosives are we talking about?
Often things like plastic explosives, C4 perhaps. They're known for being incredibly stable. You can mold them easily. And crucially, they can sometimes be made without the usual chemical markers that detection systems, even sniffer dogs, look for. Makes them extremely hard to find.
Like that CIA training exercise story.
Yeah, where sniffer dogs reportedly missed C4 hidden in a school bus engine. It just shows how difficult detection can be.
So, did Iran ever catch anyone involved in this April 2021 attack? Did they identify suspects?
Well, Iranian state TV did name a man, Reza Karimi, 43 years old, from a city called Kashan. They called him a lead culprit.
Okay.
They claimed he fled the country right after the operation. And they even showed what they said was an Interpol red notice for his arrest.
Was it real?
Well, Karimi's name doesn't actually show up on Interpol's public database of red notices, and Interpol itself declined to confirm if such a notice even exists privately. So it raises questions. Could it be disinformation? It's possible.
And did they say how he might have done it, how he got access?
No, Iranian media gave basically no details on that. An Iranian government spokesman just said a traitor had been identified and necessary measures were being taken. But there's no public sign Karimi has ever been located, and his actual role, if any, remains pretty unclear.
Okay, so after the attack, months go by. How did the actual damage assessment shake out? Was it really a 9-month delay like Israel estimated, or minor like Iran claimed?
Well, as you might expect, the truth seemed to land somewhere in the middle. An IAEA report on June 1st, 2021 gave us some clues.
What did it show?
It showed that Iran had actually produced significantly more low-enriched uranium between February and May, which sounds counterintuitive, right?
Yeah, how does that work?
But overall, nuclear progress was described as essentially a wash. Because while they lost key capabilities that could have pushed them forward faster, they might have ramped up production in the parts of the program that weren't damaged. So gains in one area, losses in another.
Okay, a wash overall. But what about the specific impact on the centrifuges, those advanced machines?
Right. David Albright, the nuclear expert we mentioned, he estimated that maybe up to 15 cascades could have been damaged or destroyed.
And each cascade has?
Each one has around 164 to 174 centrifuges. So we're talking potentially thousands of centrifuges taken offline.
That's substantial.
Very substantial. Even if they weren't totally obliterated, Albright noted that the debris from an explosion inside a tightly packed cascade hall could make simply replacing the damaged machines impractical. You might have to clear out huge sections.
So it definitely didn't end Iran's program.
Oh no, definitely not. They still had thousands of other centrifuges operating or in storage. But it was a significant blow, no question. Albright specifically speculated that maybe as many as 3 of Iran's 6 advanced IR-2 meter cascades might have been destroyed. That's a serious setback for their modernization effort.
And his later reports confirmed this.
Yeah, his analysis later, looking back in June 2022, suggested that the combined impact of the 2 big Natanz explosions, the one in June 2020 and this one in April 2021, likely reduced Iran's fleet of advanced centrifuges from thousands down to maybe only hundreds. A huge quantitative hit.
Okay, so after this April attack, bottom line, how close was Iran to having enough material for a bomb?
Well, as of that June 1st, 2021 report, Iran had managed to enrich only about 2.4 kilograms of uranium up to the 60% level. That was in the 7 weeks after the April attack.
And how much do they need for a bomb?
Albright calculates you need somewhere around 40 to 50 kilograms of that 60% enriched uranium to make a nuclear explosive. Because the jump from 60% to 90%, which is weapons grade, can be done relatively quickly with the same centrifuges.
So 2.4 kilos is not much.
Right. It means they'd produced only about 5 or 6% of what they'd need for one bomb's worth of material. So it really indicates their program was greatly weakened, both in the quantity and the quality of enrichment they could achieve directly because of that April explosion.
And that weakness translated into...
Less leverage. Less leverage in any diplomatic talks. They couldn't point to rapid progress as a bargaining chip quite as effectively.
So let's talk strategy. The timing of that April 11th strike seems crucial.
Absolutely critical. It was clearly chosen for maximum effect. You've got the Biden administration just settling in, only a few months old, and those negotiations for potentially rejoining the JCPOA were literally about to open in Vienna.
So if we assume Mossad involvement, what was Cohen's strategy here? What were the goals?
Well, it looks like it served several purposes. First, it sent a very clear message to Iran. Even your deepest, most protected facilities are not immune. We can reach you anywhere.
Disrupting Fakhrizadeh's plan.
Exactly. Disrupting that nuanced plan. Fakhrizadeh supposedly had to sort of outflank Israel by making rapid advances underground with these newer, faster centrifuges.
Yeah.
Sabotage puts a major dent in that.
And the second purpose?
Embarrassment. Deep embarrassment for Iran. right as they're heading to the negotiating table in Vienna. It allowed the U.S. and its allies to kind of brush off any claims from Iran about imminent breakthroughs or urgent threats. It weakened their hand.
So this attack, plus the big intelligence archive raid back in 2018 and the July 2020 Natanz explosion, it paints a picture.
It demonstrates a pattern, yeah. A pattern of, frankly, devastatingly effective covert operations disrupting Iran's nuclear ambitions at key moments.
Wow. What a truly remarkable and incredibly complex deep dive we've had. We've covered the intricate diplomatic dances, the internal power struggles inside Iran, and this intense shadow war playing out literally inside nuclear facilities.
It really underscores how things like intelligence, covert action, strategic timing, they can profoundly shape international relations, often unseen.
It's a testament, really, to how knowledge, when you understand the context and the different perspectives, truly empowers us.
Indeed. And critical thinking is just so essential, isn't it? Especially now, with information and sometimes disinformation coming at us from all sides. Understanding these multiple viewpoints is key.
So where does this leave us? Thinking about the cyclical nature of these conflicts, attack, rebuild, advance, another attack. With technology constantly evolving, intelligence operations adapting, what does deterrence even mean in this kind of context?
That's the core question, isn't it?
Especially when an adversary like Abbasi Divani can openly admire the beautiful design of an attack against them, even while they're vowing revenge. How might all this shape future non-proliferation efforts when it seems like the shadows, the covert actions, hold so much leverage?
A heavy question to ponder.
Definitely something for you, our listeners, to mull over